Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that troubles him. He couldn't sleep at night. Next day he called all the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans and said, "Tell me it's my dream and its interpretation. And if you don't, I will cut you in pieces, and I'll burn your houses to the ground, turn them into ash heaps." And of course they said, "There's no one who could possibly do that. There's no one who could tell you what your dream was, let alone what it meant." So his reaction was, he was furious, is what the text says. He was furious about this, and he started to have them all killed. So these stories, we share them because they're stories about our lives, about what's going on inside of us. They are a mirror to ourselves. So we look at them and go, well, how am I like that? Or how does that show up for me sometimes? So you might ask the question of yourself, well, how do I behave when I don't get what I want? How do I behave when I don't get what I want? Do you get upset when things don't go as planned or as the way that maybe you had hoped that they would go? How do you react to that? How do we react to that? Do we have unreasonable expectations? We probably say, well, they're not unreasonable. Do we get angry when we don't get what we deserve? Well, I think we can all say yes to these questions because we all have an ego. We all have a proprium that needs to be departed from. It's self-centered and it's focused on getting what we want, regardless of how it impacts other people. We all have that, but that's not who we have to be. That's the important thing to say. But it is part of us. If you wonder where that comes from, it's coming from this proprium or this ego that we have within us. Hereditarily speaking, it's passed down to us. I like to tell people, if you don't believe it, just look at a sweet little child that, starts to suddenly one day start saying, "No." Like, where did that come from? Did you suddenly do everything wrong as a parent and your child just decided to rebel? It's know that ego, that proprium started to wake up. He started to act from it. But there's part of us that we hope, with the Lord's help and with us being diligent about doing our spiritual work, that part of us can become quiescent. And the Lord actually says you can have a heavenly proprium or a heavenly ego given to you that can develop and start to dominate and rule inside you instead of the other one, which they call the hellish proprium. So here's some things that last time I talked about some things about proprium. Here's some more. Or actually it was more about love of self last time, but this says things about this proprium, or what's being termed ego in this series. It says, what is the proprium? What is the ego? The human proprium consists of everything evil and false that gushes out of self-love and love of the world. Like that word gushes. Gushes out of self-love in the world. It involves people believing not in the Lord or in the Word, but in themselves. And they're imagining that what they do not grasp through sensory evidence or through facts does not exist at all. They become, as a consequence, nothing but evil and falsity, and so have a warped view of everything. Okay? So that's if we're coming from that place. Here's some more. It says, our hellish proprium, or ego, consists in thinking about ourselves in everything. The heavenly proprium, on the other hand, consists in thinking about the neighbor, the public, the church, the Lord's kingdom, and the Lord in everything. Simple definition. And the hellish proprium is all about us. The heavenly proprium, it's about other people. It's about the Lord. It's about His church. It's about His heavenly kingdom. And this will be your favorite one. It says, regarded as to ourselves, that is, as to our entire proprium or ego, it is vilest excrement. Unless to ourselves we breathe out nothing but hatred, revenge, cruelty, and most filthy adultery. Now notice that part that says left to ourselves. But the Lord doesn't leave us to ourselves unless we try to push ourselves away from His influence. But the Lord is trying to balance that out with building a heavenly proprium or conscience within us. So the heavenly proprium or conscience is built over time as we learn what's true and as we shun evils as sins within our own lives and as we strive to do what's good and be helpful and useful to other people. So that's the good news. So it says, we are regenerated by the Lord, or made new by the Lord, and have a new will conferred on us, which is called conscience. and through which the Lord works everything good. So that's the channel through which everything good can flow into us, is this conscience that he's building, this heavenly proprium, this new will. So a lot of different words that are being used. And I know some people, when they're reading the book, were confused about, well, what is this thing called ego? How does it get defined? Often we think about it in the New Church as our proprium or old will. So we have a process to go through. Or we can just remain a Nebuchadnezzarian psycho, thinking about how he acted. Or we can humble ourselves and recognize our true condition and ask the Lord for help and take steps to change. Now, there are different ways to deal with things, and this is illustrated very well in this story. How do we help our love, or that new will, that new ego, to have strength over our proprium or ego? Well, let's look at Nebuchadnezzar for a moment. He says, I can do this because I'm king, and I should have what I want. Now think about that in relation to ourselves. Do we ever do that? I was disturbed by my dream. I need to know what it means. You will fix it, or you will die. It's pretty clear-cut, his way of dealing with things. His dominant emotion is anger, because he's not getting what he wants. And anger is another thing to think about in this context. It says that anger is the general emotion that results from anything which gets in the way of self-love and its desires. So you can see that played out here. What gets in the way of what I want? And I think this is a really good exercise if you're wondering to look at your own anger issues, if you have them, which you all do in some way. When you ask yourself, when I get angry, what is it that I wanted to happen that isn't happening? Or what was it that I cared for, that I wanted, that is getting thwarted? What did I not get? I was thinking about that when I get unreasonably angry if my child spills something in the kitchen. It's like, well, it's not a big deal. It takes a moment to clean it up. But I didn't want to clean it up. I didn't want to have to be interrupted and clean it up. So it's really not about the spilling. It's about, I wanted order and I wanted things to be a certain way, and they weren't. So that's when anger shows up. So that's a simple example of that. Another thing that the writings say is that while there's love, and then there's the anger is the opposite of love, and it's also a failing. It's interesting wording there. It says it's a failing. So I know sometimes we like to think, or psychology likes to say, well, it's good to act from anger. You have to actually get in touch with that. And the writings say pretty strongly that actually it's kind of like putting gas on a fire. You know, it's just going to make it worse when you act out on it. You actually have to find a way to depart from it. So it's kind of a failing on our part when we let anger take us over. Now, you might be arguing in your mind that, well, what about zeal? Well, zeal is a good kind of emotion that looks a lot like anger. Classic example is your child is about to run into the street where cars are going by, and you're shouting at them to get out of the way. And they feel like, why are you so angry at me? Well, you're not angry. You care about their lives. So it looks like that, and you want to protect them, and you do whatever you can to protect them. But when the danger subsides, then we cool down. Anger doesn't have that same reaction. When anger doesn't get what it wants, it keeps going, and it wants to hurt, and it wants to keep hurting. It doesn't have any definition to it. Whereas zeal wants to protect. Once the danger is gone, we stop. So let's look a little bit more at Nebuchadnezzar's reactions to things. Last week, when the chief of the eunuchs was asked by Daniel, can we have just vegetables and water for 10 days and see how we look? His reaction was, well, I fear my lord the king. My head, or it endangers my head. In other words, if the king doesn't like this, he's going to cut off my head. So he knows a little bit about the king, and he knows the king's not a reasonable person. This story says, if you don't make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your house shall be made an ash heap. When he didn't get what he wants, the king was very angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. The story of next week with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, when they did not bow down to the God that he set up, it says he was full of fury. The expression on his face changed, and he said, crank up that furnace 7 times hotter than it normally is to punish them. Like, I'm going to make sure that they're really burning. And, if you don't know the story, come next week, you'll find out what happens. But in stark contrast to that ego left to itself, that what's anger and the negativity is Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar trusts himself. He lives in fear because of that. He lives in anxiety. He has a lot of worry. He has rage. He needs to know the future. He needs to know what's going to happen. He has this dream, and he won't rest till he knows what it means. So he trusts himself instead of the Lord. And when he's not served, he gets angry. Daniel, what does he do? First thing he does is he asks for time. Slow it down. Just breathe. Take a breath. Don't make flip choices or be reactionary. Breathe. Meditate on it. We're all living busy lives. What are we doing to slow down the pace? And I ask that of you, I ask that of myself, what are we doing to slow down so that we aren't always on the immediate reaction? Do you go on walks? Do you breathe? And I don't just mean breathe because you're alive, but take a deep breath. Well, it takes up too much time. I can't do that. Do we read? Do we meditate? Do we do yoga? It doesn't really matter what it is that you do, but what do we do to make space to slow down? So we have the ability when something comes up like this. I don't have to react. I don't have to react from anger. What are some other options? So that's the first thing, is ask for time. Second thing that Daniel does is he goes and talks with his companions. He goes and talks with other people. Who are your people? Who do you talk to when you're under duress, when you're stressed? Or do you just deal with it all by yourself? Maybe that works for you. But who is the person? Who are your counselors, so to speak, that you go to? Who are your friends that you deal with these things with? And the next thing he does is he prays. And that's easy to forget. But in a busy world, it's easy to forget. But I imagine that it's easy to forget because hell is working against us. They know that prayer is a useful weapon because it engages the Lord, because we have to engage the Lord. He's not going to just come in and say, well, let me just fix everything for you. He wants to know that we're freely choosing to invite the Lord into our lives. So by ourselves, we are, the writings say, trying to deal with the whole of hell by our own strength. And we really have no chance. So here's a little passage that talks about that. It says, hell is like one monstrous giant, acting against one evil in its falsity. Notice that, just one that we're dealing with. Is like taking on that monstrous giant or all of hell. No one can do this except God. By ourselves we can do no more against evil and so falsity than a fish against the ocean, a flea against a whale, or a speck of dust against an avalanche, much less than a locust against an elephant or a fly against a camel. I hope that passage sinks in a little bit. Just what am I doing to engage the Lord? I don't have any power. And if you have the experience of failing over and over again, it might be, well, I'm still trying to do this by myself. And this is telling us you can't do it by yourself. It's impossible. We don't have that ability. The Lord can, however. The next thing I want to say is that Daniel's intention, it's a good thing to look at. What did he want? He didn't want people to be hurt. He didn't want the rest of the wise men of Babylon to be hurt or his companions to be hurt. So we ask ourselves, what is my intention when I'm doing something? And when he did all those things, the answer was revealed to him. But the last thing I want to mention that he did is that he gave credit to the Lord for it. He didn't say, there was no one else wise enough in the kingdom but I. Let me tell you your dreams, sir, and let me tell you what it means. And give me those riches that you promised. He's like, no, there's only one person who could possibly do this, and that's the Lord. I couldn't do it by myself. Recognize where our strength and guidance come from. So Daniel in these stories pictures that part of us that can be changed, that can be reformed. It says those who are being reformed by means of truths from the Word and by means of temptations are meant by Daniel. So the title for this week in the book and in this sermon is Intentions Over Expectations. So how do we live with an intention of being loving, gentle, patient, and kind, rather than the expectation of you will serve me, and if you don't, I will get angry with you? You've probably heard this said before, that expectations are premeditated disappointments. When you expect something, most likely you're not going to get it the way that you had hoped, or you just won't be served the way you had hoped. And then here's another one that says unrealistic expectations are premeditated resentments. Another way to say that. Why am I getting upset? Because I expected this. Kind of just come into the situation with the intention of finding out, well, what does this person need? Not just what do I need, but what would help the whole situation. So today we are invited to take the Holy Supper, and I think that makes sense because the recognition by correspondence that everything that we have that's loving, that's wise, that's patient, that's good, is from the Lord. And those are pictured by the bread and the wine. The bread pictures the Lord's love and his goodness. And the wine symbolizes wisdom or understanding that he gives us from his word or truth. It's our spiritual food. It's the source of our life. It's what keeps us alive. We can't live without it. So taking that in a state of humility, coming up here and receiving that from the Lord is recognizing that I need that. Without it, I don't have the power to exist, let alone do anything. So I invite you to think about that as you come freely and receive what's offered to you. The Lord's love, his goodness, his wisdom, his truth, our spiritual food. Amen.